Welcome everyone to today's REINSW webinar on combustible cladding. So today we have our lovely presenters Christine, Nesbit and Leisha. Before I hand over to Leisha, I do just want to read a bit of a disclaimer before we kick off. So this webinar is not intended to be legal advice and the information provided is of general nature only. Please consult your legal representative should you require advice on a specific matter. I'll now pass you on to Leisha. Thanks, Leisha.
Good morning, everyone. Chris and I are going to speak with you today about combustible cladding. This is a topic which I think sometimes is viewed simply as a construction issue, but really it isn't, and it's absolutely essential for strata managers to be across this. We'll walk through some of the case studies and essentially this is what we're going to be talking about today, but it will unfold, I think, as to why it's so relevant to your practice and to being a strata manager. And we're trying to focus on the practical, but in order to do that, we need to walk through some of the steps in terms of what exactly it is so that you can recognise it and understand why it's important and also explain that to your owners. You'll notice that it's very prevalent in the media and the news. It's quite a hot topic, excuse the pun, but it's relevant to particularly tower buildings, tall buildings, and I think it's important that we walk through some case studies so that you understand exactly why it's relevant when it's a key issue, and then that will help you to identify in particular which buildings you need to focus on and why it's relevant in your practice. We need to also look at the legal framework. So the key thing that will affect strata buildings, and which we'll get to and Chris will talk about, is registration. So that's going to be the most important thing for you in the short term. But it's important to understand that within what's happening more broadly. How is government looking at it, and how is government making it okay? The part of that is product use ban, part of that is registration requirements, but there are other statutory changes that are occurring. And I think ultimately, and this is the practical bit, I think this is what we should try and spend a fair bit of time on, is managing risk and how do you do that within your scheme. And that's where I think Chris will have the most useful insight as a strata manager herself. And I think looking at this in the context of, as we were discussing earlier, Chris was saying it feels a lot like the asbestos management process. Yes. And so I think having a strata manager with us today who is fully across that, who has experience in managing out a risk like asbestos, will be really useful in terms of talking about how we did it then and how we'll do it going forward. So let's just start with what it is. External cladding is essentially a multi-layered material. So it's, and we'll go through some diagrams to give you a really clear illustration of what it is and why it's dangerous and how it combusts. But it's essentially a sandwich type material, and it can cover part or all of a building exterior. So it might cover just, for example, around the front facade, because it might just be for aesthetics. So you might see it just on an entryway, or you might see it on every balcony. You might see it on one side of a building or half of a building. It depends on the building, and that also adds to the risk in terms of how much there is and where it is.
And the other thing too, if I just might jump in there, it takes on many forms.
That's right, it
does take on many forms, where you look at it as a strata manager and say, well, it looks like bricks to me. It looks like cladding, which is paling. It looks like weatherboard. It looks like, you know, all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and you might not recognise it as being the combustible cladding.
Yeah, look, and I think that's a great point. And we'll actually show you some illustrations coming up, Chris, which I think will really illustrate your point there.
Absolutely.
And I think that's kind of a key reason why you'll need to get experts involved, and why you'll need to make your owners aware that that's essential.
Yeah.
You probably, there will be some buildings where it will be evident that there's no cladding at all, but where it's a maybe, then I really think you need to be very careful.
And some cladding too, as we were just discussing, could be covered with an external product. Like it might have been rendered.
Absolutely.
To make it look like that it sits, you know, within the building. Over brick. But it looks like it is over brick, but in some cases it could be cladding, which is combustible, which has been covered with rendell. And the thing is, with the render, that's fine, but the underneath surface is what's flammable.
Yes, and I think in terms of the cost for your owners corporation of having an expert come out and just make that call rather than that being a strata manager's call is incredibly important.
Very important.
The last thing you want to do is be making a judgment call on the type of material that might be there if it's not crystal clear.
Yeah.
So the thing with combustible cladding is, by virtue of its name, it can ignite easily and burn rapidly. So that's why it's such a big deal. And the case studies will show you some horrendous outcomes, which are just awful. And I think that will make it clear why it has such that there's such a force behind it, and it is so important, even if it weren't statutory, even if it wasn't a statutory obligation. It's just important for the safety of your residents and owners to really focus on getting this right. So the one other key thing, and this will really become evident as we go through the case studies and we look at the different types of materials, is that it's not just about the cladding, it's also about the overall fire safety of the building. So in terms of what you need to do, it might be that all you need to do is register it, and then you'll find out later that your building, despite having some combustible cladding, may be okay if it has the rest of other fire safety mechanisms in place, which make it satisfactory. So, and that's really evident in the recent BCAT decision for the lacrosse towers, which we'll get to. So this is an image of how it looks. You can see there it's effectively a sandwich type material. So it has two outer layers. This is a standard type of cladding. It has two outer layers, metal outer layers, and then an inner core material. It's the inner core material that's problematic. So the typical and the most publicised type of cladding that is of concern is the aluminium composite panels, which is the ACP. And it's the polyethylene core, which is the key concern. So there's different fire-resistant properties depending on the composition of the polyethylene, and the product plan, which we'll get to later, is very specific about what level of polyethylene is okay within external cladding, so that it's not considered a combustible risk. The problem with that polyethylene is that it has poor fire-resistant properties, and it ignites easily, which then destabilises the outer shells. So this is an image now, a diagram of the process of ignition. I think this is really helpful in just making it crystal clear as to how the process occurs. So the surfaces, which are the aluminium skin, they would heat up first, and it doesn't take much. If you imagine it's a little bit, I've heard it described this way, is that it's a little bit like having ice cream between two biscuits. Like the ice cream melts very quickly and quicker than the biscuits, and so the level of heat is not necessarily going to need to be extreme in order to melt the middle. But once the middle melts and it drips out, that catches fire very easily. And then it causes, you can see the warping, it causes the exterior aluminium to warp because the binding fails. So this is the type of cladding system that I was saying earlier would really help illustrate Christine's example, where you have, it's an external wall cladding system. So it's slightly different to that sandwich, the standard sandwich style. What it is the foam insulation is affixed to the wall, and then they put an additional, it's almost like they create the sandwich, but it's affixed specifically to the wall, and it has an extra finished coating. It's the extra finished coating that is problematic.
Which is the render.
Yes, exactly. It often looks like a render. I've read that you can, I've read on some of the government websites that it has if you knock on it, it has a more hollow sound. If I was a strata manager, I wouldn't be relying on my knock test to determine whether or not to register my building. I'd be having, as soon as there was rent, I'd be saying, no, that's not a call for me. And I don't know about you, Chris, but I think that there'd be many buildings where you'd have parts of it that have a different type of finish or a different type of render or a mix, where it's just safer to say, guys, I'm not making a call on this. If you don't register it, then you'll be in breach, and I think you should get an expert.
And many times you can look at a building, and you can look at a building with your eyes not completely wide open, and look at it and say, does it have that combustible cladding in it? Is it covered? Some buildings can look very normal, and you look at them all the time and say, well, everything's fine, but it's not till you get closer up and you have a real good look about it. I think that's what strata managers have got to do.
Oh, yeah.
And if there's any element of doubt whatsoever, then it needs to be taken further.
Like, I can't imagine a more terrifying experience than being the strata manager who said, this looks fine, and then it being peeled off years later, and finding out that actually it was prohibited cladding.
Yeah, or worse than that, a fire breakdown.
Yeah, let's not even think about that.
No.
Case. That would be terrible. So moving on to case studies, which I think is a really helpful place to start. So we know what we're dealing with now, we know what it looks like, and we know why it's dangerous. So I think now it's important to see why it has become so evident. And I think looking back, it's become a very popular product over the course of the last 10 to 20 years. And Chris and I were discussing this earlier. It's probably a good idea to be looking specifically at those kind of buildings within your portfolio, the buildings that have been either new buildings within the last 10 to 20 years, or and even the late 90s. I'd probably go back to 90s and 80s. But this is a building where they just put new cladding on, so it's not actually a new building. This is a building in terms of, and here we're talking about the the image here I'm talking about is the Grenfell Tower.
Well, I think if I'm right, it was built in the 1970s, and then it had a new cladding put on it on the outside. So
yes, absolutely.
And that's the cladding that was put on it actually had a gap between that and the original concrete structure of the building, and that caused the air gap inside because the fire had to seek oxygen. As you know, for a fire to take hold, you have to have an ignition point, you need flammable material, and you need oxygen. And that's exactly what this building had, where it was trying to find the oxygen in the downdraft, and up she went, and it just kept on climbing.
And that's it, it's the climbing that's absolutely a risk.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're quite right. It was a new cladding that was put on an old building. So don't be fooled by the age of your building.
No.
It's about the age of the cladding.
You might look at your building and say, oh, it was built in the 1960s or 1970s or whenever. But if it's been reclad, then watch out.
Exactly. So let's start with the Lacrosse building, which is a local, and when I say local, Victorian case example. So this happened in Melbourne in 2014, and from this point in time, there was some noise about cladding just prior to this, but it's really ramped up as an issue in Australia, and then it's got additional force following the Grenfell, which we'll get to as the next case study. So in relation to this particular case study, and the timing of this seminar is actually quite good because the VCAT hearing came out a few weeks ago, so we can actually look at what they decided was what the cause was and how it will be considered going forward. But in terms of the background, it was a 21-storey building, and the balconies are the area of the building which had ACP with a polyethylene core. The problem with the polyethylene core here is it was 100% polyethylene. That's a concern. Now under the product use ban, which we'll get to later, you'll see that the percentage requirements are virtually nil. So to have 100%, highly risky. It also covered a significant amount of the building, which was also a considerable issue. And balconies in a residential building, which is particularly relevant to strata managers managing strata buildings, because I would imagine that most of your residential towers have balconies. If there is cladding on the balconies, that is the riskiest place for them to be. Why is it the riskiest place to be? Because that's where hot works occur. That's where people smoke.
And that's where they have barbecues.
Exactly, that's where they have barbecues. So, so that is a real concern. Combustible cladding on the balconies. In this particular situation, the fire spread up 13 stories in 10 minutes. Now, you can imagine how quick that is when you just think of your own fire alarms, where sometimes it takes you 10 minutes, where it's you're going, oh, this is probably not a real one, the fire alarm's gone off again. In a building, sometimes it takes people 10 minutes to just decide it's a real thing. And in this case, it went up 13 stories in 10 minutes. So they were fortunate here that there were no fatalities or serious injuries, and I would expect that that's probably because it was a newer building.
That's a very quick time though, isn't it?
Sorry?
Very quick time to go up.
That's right. Yeah. So it was, but it meant that it went up, and so you can see that I'll probably come back to this picture, but you can see there it went directly vertical. Yes. That's one of the key issues with cladding. It goes directly vertical when the fire catches it. It travels up the building, and that's because of that previous image that we looked at. You can see it it melts and then it catches in an upwards fashion, and also with the oxygen draft, as Christine was talking about. So this made it important, in Australia at least, that this was a big deal, even though there were no fatalities. So in terms of the VCAT hearing, which just recently came out, what was interesting about it is they said, look, everyone thought that the builder would be primarily responsible for this because they were the ones that had fixed the cladding. The way that this particular fire started was there was a young gentleman who was an occupant, and he went out and had a smoke on a cigarette. He put the cigarette in a plastic container, and that plastic container didn't put it properly out, and the plastic container set it alight. So when they were considering who was responsible in terms of this particular factual scenario, they looked at a lot of different parties, and in particular, the Owners Corporation was seeking compensation from the builder. Interestingly, the builder was found to only be required, and they were seeking quite large sums of money. So $5 million, let's say approximately $5 million worth of the damages was agreed between the parties as being real damage suffered. And then I think that all up, they were looking for either another 12 or 12 altogether in terms of 12 million in terms of damages that were perceived to be attainable. So that's still being resolved, that's still being negotiated and agreed. But in terms of responsibility, the builder was found to only be responsible for 3% of the damage caused.
Yes.
The rest of the damage was attributable to people who specifically chose the cladding, so the architect, people who certified it as fire safe, the fire certifier, and people who certified the building as a whole. So the surveyor, which is the surveyor in Victoria, it's different here, we would have a PC, but in Victoria it's the building surveyor. And there was also issues in terms of this building, which has now changed the laws in Victoria, where it wasn't possible to issue a rectificate for a surveyor to require something to be rectified once the equivalent of the final occupation certificate has been issued. Right. So they've changed the laws now so they can issue further notices even after a final occupation certificate's been issued to try and remedy that. So the proportion of responsibility was the surveyor, who is the person who certified the building, was found 33% responsible. The architect, who specified the material and asked the builder to put that material on the building, was found 25% responsible. And the fire engineer, who said that it was appropriate from a fire safety standard, was found 39% responsible. That left 3% of responsibility, and that was actually attributed to the young gentleman who had put his cigarette out on his balcony. But because he wasn't joined as a party to the matter, that 3% was put to the builder. So what they said, though, that was really interesting, is they said this building and the type of damages that have been awarded here shouldn't be used as a case example of exactly what's going to happen every time. It was found that the particular circumstances for this building made it a high-risk building, so that being the 100% polyethylene core, and also the fact that there were 4,000 square metres of cladding around the building. So there was a high usage and a high concentration of particularly combustible material. It was also high risk because it was on the balconies of a residential tower. So if it was used, for example, around an entry foyer only, that just may not be an issue because the combustibility won't run up the building. No, it would have been the same way. It would be contained. It would be contained within that. Yes. Yeah. So that is why what is interesting is that, yes, there are significant damages awarded. Yes, the consultants involved were responsible for that, but it became evident that it really depends, and what they said a number of times is it really depends on the overall fire safety of the building. So, which is really evident in our next case study in terms of the fire safety of the whole building. Yeah. So this is the Grenfell Tower, which occurred in London in 2017, and is obviously horrific. This is a terrible story, and it's incredibly tragic. It was a 24-storey building, and the facade was ACP, so polyethylene core, which is what we've been talking about. As Christine said, it was an old building, a 1970s building, which was refit with their cladding, and that was for thermal purposes, so to make it warmer. Unfortunately, the history with this building is that it was a low-income building, so it was designed for low-income residents and it was managed by a government entity. The low-income residents had been petitioning the government for many years before the fire, saying that it was not fire safe. They had a blog set up. They were complaining about the lack of exits, the poor fire safety. They were saying they were genuinely worried and in fear. And then this occurred, which is why it's really been, I think, it's changed the whole face of construction and cladding, and also the government's response. And you can see that when we get to even here in Australia, the government response has been incredibly proactive. Absolutely. Because I think that they see this as, look, you know, there was 72 people that died. It reached the roof of the building in under 30 minutes. So that's a 24-storey building. Yeah. It burned for 60 hours. They couldn't put it out. The fire resources that were sent to this building was so significant. It was incredible that they couldn't put it out. And it all started from a kitchen fire on the 4th floor, which was a faulty fridge fire. And they had this awful, they had this part of the fire safety control for this building was that the policy that they employed was that if the fire was in your apartment, you weren't allowed to leave until it was contained. Correct. That's exactly right. Yeah. So they disbanded that after a certain period had passed, but it was too late for many people.
They were trapped inside their
units because they had been told they were not allowed.
That's right. Leave. They were trying to do the right thing and stay there.
And manage it for the other residents. Now, the reason why this is a really interesting case study in the sense that we talked about the overall fire safety of the building is that, and the reason why it was so horrific with such horrific outcomes was because it was such an old building. It only had one exit route, which was through the centre of the building. And a lot of what the residents have been complaining about was that there was poor fire management because it was a low-income building. There were things like mattresses that were just in the hallways.
In the hallways, yeah.
So lots of flammable materials in the hallways. So it wasn't just contained to the exterior of the building. Once it came in the building, it was so poorly managed that it was really hard for people to then get to the central staircase and then get out because there were things that were likely to block their way.
Yes.
And there weren't things like sprinklers and other kind of extra fire safety requirements which you would normally expect to and want to see in a building like this. So it's just a horrific outcome. But I think what's important is that all the governments seem to have learned from it. The changes to our laws have been rapid and they have been significant.
Well, it's been very good.
Yes.
Yeah, they put in a good 10-point action plan, which included the task force. And I think that's good.
Yeah, and I think it's critical.
It's very critical.
It's just, and I think if owners or residents are unhappy about needing to comply with the new laws, I think that this is a really timely reminder that it's not about being difficult. It's about their safety, and it's about having a product that it would be like no one would want asbestos in their building. People understand that now and they know that. Yep. It's a similar situation. So moving on to the cladding task force, this is what's being done, and I think it's important. We've looked at now what is cladding, why is it risky, why does it catch fire, what's happened in the past, so where do we see the risk, and now we need to look at how they're implementing changes to the laws to manage that. So the cladding task force, and we're going to focus mainly on New South Wales. It's quite different in all the states. We'll get to that. But in New South Wales, it's managed by the Department of Finance, Service and Innovation. So it's an interagency task force, which means that they work with the fire services, they work with councils, they work with different agencies to manage that. Part of what they do is, a big part of what they do is they've been investigating buildings. So the last few years have been focused on data audits and fire safety inspections. And I think when you look at the next slide, you'll see just how much data they've collected. And I think that's why we're now moving to registration, because it is a simpler way for them to manage that process and weed out the problematic buildings. So the high-risk categories, where we say here in this slide that they're prioritising residential buildings and high-risk categories. High-risk categories are considered residential towers for the reasons that we've just discussed, but also towers that have the vulnerables. so disabled or childcare type
That's right.
facilities
Yeah.
where they're a vulnerable part of the society, and also where there's significant gatherings, so things like churches and
cinemas and theatres.
Yeah, lots of people, high fire risk, all exiting at once.
Yeah.
Part of this audit was that developers and building owners would be notified if their building was identified in the data audit, and it would be managed that way. This is the activities that they've been that has been undertaken, and this is some of the facts and figures from that. So you'll see that it's quite a lot of building records that have been reviewed and inspections, like into thousands.
185,000 building records.
That's it.
It's amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of the high risk, they found out of all of those, and this is why I think that they want to institute the register, which is where we'll get to, and that's what's really important for strata managers, is that they've looked at that many buildings, 185,000, but then they've identified only 450 that are high risk, and then of those 450, it's my understanding that at least 85 have been put into the not a high risk category. So there's still even one building is too many, right? But that's a small number in proportion to the number of buildings that they need to look.
Yeah, I believe that there's many more out there. 450 buildings identified so far. I think there's a lot more out there.
Yeah, and I think that they concentrate in the high density areas, and so what they're trying to do in this registration process is look beyond that.
Well, they'll capture everything if they do it the way that they're doing it with the registration.
It's like a fishing net. They're just throwing it out there. They see what comes in, and then they can sift through and sort out which are the higher risk, and then from the higher risk, nut out which ones are the really
well, one high risk building is one too many.
I agree completely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that they've tried it this way, and now they're moving into the registration process. So the new legislation, they've brought in lots of different types of ways to regulate this. So they're not attacking it in one way; they're attacking it in many ways, and we'll touch on those. But I really think for today's seminar, we should focus on the one that most affects you. The cladding ban works hand in hand with the registration process, so we will spend some time on the cladding ban, because that's why it's the registration process will, I think, speak to the cladding ban, and that's how they will sift through what's a high risk and then whether or not it's a cladding ban, and then action it via that legislation. The other thing that they're doing is obviously general awareness. You can see that in terms of advertising and letters to owners and residents, and telling people we think your building might be problematic, so that people will try and action it, because really, it's just for everyone's benefit to fix it. It's very expensive, but it's for everyone's benefit. So this is the product. So the product use ban, the Building Product Safety Act, was introduced in 2017, and under that ban, it provided for the New South Wales Commissioner to be able to issue a ban on certain products and building products which were considered unsafe. In late last year, so 5 August 2018, the Commissioner issued a product ban in relation to ACP, which had retrospective effect. This is why, when I talked about in the beginning of the session, people thinking that it's purely about construction. Yes, it is very much about construction. Going forward, you will not be able to use this product. It's important that people know that you can't. It's important that people understand about the penalties that are associated with constructing with a prohibited product, and about removing and replacing that product. But in terms of this retrospective effect, that's very much a property issue and a property management and strata management issue. So we're advising a lot of our large commercial clients who have large portfolios about these are the types of things you need to look at if you have it, and how do you manage it, looking at it from a retrospective perspective, because it is a retrospective ban. So this is really interesting in the context of us talking previously about the 100% polyethylene core. With what the ban relates to is only a 3% core. So you can see the difference between what was used in lacrosse and what is now being considered unsafe. 3% is clearly very, very small, and the test, which we'll get to, which you can undertake to confirm whether or not you're exempt from the ban, are difficult to pass, but there are products out there which people are now advertising as being compliant. So it relates to external cladding, so external wall, external insulation, facade, or rendered finish. So, and that creeps in again our discussion about rendered finish, which I just think is going to be a really tricky one for strata managers. You can see here that their focus for the product ban is exclusively on tower buildings, and that's for the reason that we discussed. It runs up the building.
Yes.
So there's two types of construction there, type A and type B construction, and I'm not a construction lawyer, but my understanding is that the different types of construction relate to the different types of fire safety construction.
In the buildings. Yep.
That's right. And so those particular classes of building we'll look at on the next slide, but they're limited to the product ban actually covers quite a broad range of buildings. Registration doesn't, but the product safety ban does.
Yes.
So these are all the classes that are covered, and you'll see that class 2, class 3, they relate to residential style living. So whether it's your own residential building or unrelated people, so hotels.
Mainly reduced sleeping arrangements, accommodation and sleeping arrangements.
Exactly.
It's a good way to remember it.
And 5, 6 and 7 are going to be more your commercial style buildings.
Correct.
So things like car parks, commercial buildings, shopping and retail, where people don't sleep overnight. Class 8 is laboratories and factories, and they don't seem particularly concerned with that because I think the cladding is just not really used in factories or laboratories, and they tend to be single story, large sheds, so not towers. And building 9, class 9 is a risky category, so that's buildings of a public nature. They're the types that we were talking about, so high risk categories or people gathering.
Public assembly, aged care, and that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly. For the product use ban, the consequences are significant. So what is interesting is that in terms of contravening the Act, so it has retrospective effect. To contravene it, you have to use the product, for example, to use it in building work going forward, or to represent that the product is suitable for use. So that would be trying to sell the product as being safe when it is not safe.
Not safe, that's right.
And then the penalties you can see are significant.
And knowing about it as well.
Yes.
Knowing that they've actually done that.
Exactly. Now, what is problematic for a building owner is that it is retrospective, and using the product is the wording in the legislation. So arguably the fact that it is merely present on the building is a breach of the product use ban. However, as we go through, you'll see that in terms of enforcement of the Act, it's likely to only be enforced by way of a rectification order. So if you have it, you should be dealing with it because there is a risk of a rectification order. So the identification and notification under the Act, affected buildings, you can be issued, notices can be issued to relevant persons. So those types of persons are normally owners, they can be occupiers, and they can be local authorities, so the council or the Fire and Rescue in New South Wales. The notice would identify the affected part of the building and the particular safety risk. I'm just going to go through this part a little bit quicker because I want to make sure we have enough time on the stuff that's really important to you. But if you did have that product used, then what you would normally be issued with is a rectification order, which would say, look, you need to either eliminate that risk or minimise the risk or remediate it or restore it. And there is mechanisms within the legislation to provide for you to have time to fix and remedy that and liaise with them about that. There's also really broad investigative powers. So if they think that your building is problematic, they can come in, they can take samples, they can demand records, they can demand building records, they can demand those from the builder, from the property owner. They can do testing, and they can do destructive testing, which means that they take part of your building and go and test it. So the two exceptions, as I mentioned, they're in the product use ban, and it's essentially sending either taking your product and testing it and meeting a certain Australian standard, or preparing a prototype where it's not just the separate cladding, it's actually affixing it to the facade, which is like that last image we looked at where it can look like render. You have to prepare a prototype and then test that, and then you have to sign a statutory declaration to say you will build the external walls exactly as per the prototype that passed the test. And it needs to be done in an accredited lab and all kinds of things to pass those tests. So the new stuff, this is the important bit. This is what I'd like to spend a bit more time on because this is what I think you need to be focusing on. Recently, late 2018, the relevant legislation was amended to require registration of certain classes of building that were considered high risk. So, and for your purposes, I think the most important one when you look at that slide is residential high rise. So that's going to be most of your strata, I would say. So accommodation for unrelated people is also a high risk, but I think you'll see less of that in the strata space. So that would be things like hotels, backpackers, things like that. They're generally going to be single owner buildings and buildings of a public nature. Again, important, but not so much for strata managers. So we're going to focus on residential high rise. So you're going to have to go to the New South Wales cladding registration portal. So we've got here the website address for you. And Chris and I were discussing, you know, in terms of asking questions about how you do this and what happens. I think that that's a journey that you'll probably need to go through if you have any specific queries about, you know, I'm not sure whether I need to register this building or things like that.
Your building registration was finished on February the 22nd.
That's right.
And we understand that this webinar is later than that.
Yes.
But that's not to say if you suspect, still register your building.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
I think that the requirement in the legislation is that for old existing buildings that they should have been registered by 22 February.
Yeah.
But like with any kind of deadline, if that has passed and you haven't done it, then you just need to make it a high priority for your owners corporation and get it done. There's a tab on the website for frequently asked questions, and I'm sure that there are resources in terms of queries that you may have.
The cladding registration website is quite good. The portal's very good. You do have to have a password and you know, your sign in and your password, so you do have to register.
Yes.
You do have to fill out your forms, but yeah, it's very easy to understand.
Okay, brilliant. So in terms of the scope of external combustible cladding for the purposes of registration, this is external cladding in relation to a building that you might be managing has this kind of definition, which is any cladding or cladding system comprising any of those elements that attach to the external walls or to any external area of the building. As we mentioned, that might just be the front entryway, it might be just the balconies, it might be the whole building.
Could be windows, they might have windows.
Exactly, often they're around just around
often
the windows.
they're just around the window area.
Yeah. And it also includes any insulated cladding system. So these are very technical issues, and they're things that if I were a strata manager, I don't think I'd be wanting to make those decisions on my own.
Always get some expert help.
Yeah.
If you're unsure, and I mean you're strata managers, we're not construction experts, and I think that if you need help to identify, then get the help you need.
Yes, and you just don't want to take on that risk. It's not, you're not paid to take on that risk. It's not part of your practice. Part of your practice is to tell them that this is out there. They need to comply, and they need to authorise you to engage the right people.
Absolutely, and the owners corporation need to be fully aware of that as well.
Absolutely. So registration of affected building types. So we touched on this before. We did talk about all the different classes. What this does apply to is buildings that are 2 stories or more. So if I was a strata manager, I was looking at my portfolio, I'd be going anything that's over two stories. That's in the watch pile.
Absolutely.
Yep. And then do they fit with any of these categories? Are they apartment buildings? Are they other accommodation for unrelated people? Buildings of a public nature? I really think you only have to worry about class 2, to be honest, because I think that that's going to be the main strata.
That's what's going to be the strata buildings. Yeah.
So are they over 2 stories, and are they apartment buildings, residential strata? So the regulation doesn't apply to houses. It doesn't apply to non-habitation. It doesn't apply to commercial buildings, shops, factories or warehouses. So if you've got industrial strata, it doesn't matter. So however, as you can see in that little asterisk there, they are suggesting that those other categories of buildings may well need to be registered going into the future. At this point in time, though, I think what they want to do is narrow the flow of information to them to the high-risk areas, which is why they're focused on registration of the high-risk categories.
And the other issue there probably could be a stratum where you've got a mix of commercial and you've got residential on
Absolutely,
top.
yes.
So therefore, if you've got any residential, I would still, and you suspect that there's combustible cladding, I would certainly register the building and let them come back to you and say, well, no, you don't need to do this, but I think being accommodation, you still have an obligation to do that.
That's right. Yeah, so if there's no cladding cladding on your residential tower, but there is on the commercial below, even though it's outside of the category. I think Chris is absolutely right.
Yeah.
I'd be registering.
I would too, just to be sure.
Yeah. So, so this is when you have to register. Owners must register if they have external combustible cladding, as we've discussed in that definition, and if the building is in an affected class. So this is the type of, it's not hard. These are the types of things you need to put in. I think what is hard is my building in this category? So they're getting the technical advice up front to determine whether you need to register.
Exactly right.
So then you can answer some of these questions.
Yeah.
So obviously name and address, easy. Building address. Building classification, that just means which class. So class 2 if it's residential tower. Number of stories, tick, easy. It's the description of the cladding where you need an expert to assist you with that.
And that's why I think this presentation is really good for, you know, as a reminder and a checklist.
That's right.
For strata managers to go through and tick that off.
That's it, yeah, and just sift through your portfolio and start and making it, for those buildings that do fit potentially within this category, something that is talked about and revisited at meetings if it is identified. And even if you register and you're not required to do something immediately, it might be something that the owners want to do something about. So the other thing you'll need to, going back to the list, you'll need to describe the extent of the cladding. So that obviously means, as Chris and I were talking about before, is it just on the windows? Is it just on the entry? Is it all over the building? That will most likely determine whether or not you're going to be on their watch list or not, in terms of how much there is, whether there is cladding, and the parts of the building affected. So if your registration says, yes, this has cladding, it seems like it's ACP and it's on every balcony, then I think you'll probably get a call in terms of what needs to happen next. And I think it's important for you to know what are the high risk categories. So then when you're talking to your owners, you'll sound informed and you'll say, guys, this looks low risk to me. I'm not an expert, but where it's high risk is it's, you know, in these areas where it can run up the side of the building. There's a lot of it. It's high ACP. The experts are telling me it's low polyethylene. There's barely any on the building. So hopefully for us, it's low risk. Either way, we have to register. It's not my call.
That is, yeah.
So the registration requirements and deadlines, Chris touched on this. So it applies retrospectively. So for buildings occupied before 22 October 2018, so any buildings basically. The deadline for registration was 22 February. If you've missed that deadline, do what you can. Just get it in as soon as you can. I suspect that it'll be a bit like window safety devices, where there'll be quite a few people missing the deadline, but you just need to do it as soon as you can.
And like the asbestos with Mr. Fluffy too that we all went through. I think that was the same thing. There was a lot of confusion about that when it first started off, because there was a timeline put on there for owners to report it. Then they realised that owners weren't going to report it. And so they left it up to the strata managers. I think the strata managers did a better job and they got it through, and they're still being worked on, you know, I believe today. But anyway, at least we registered and at least it was in the pipeline, and that'll be a little bit like this.
Well, that's it. Yeah, I think they're just looking for, we need a watch list. We need to gather information and we need to have people come to us. And I think your role is, as you say, it's a trusted role. It's a management role to manage a group of people in a tower building. So,
and as you say, the registration then is a net that captures everything, not just concentrates on the high rise, but it captures anything over 2 stories. And I think that if you're in doubt, register your building, have it checked. It's in the pipeline. That's the best thing that you can do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for new buildings, there's a different deadline. It's 4 months after first occupation. I don't see any reason why you would need to wait 4 months after occupation, but
no.
So, and I think that if it is present in a new building and I was managing that strata scheme, I would absolutely be talking to the builder about that. And whether you want to occupy, depending on the extent and whether or not it's
4 months is a long time.
Yes, and so for new buildings, really it's something that should be considered before occupation because we know about it now. So where we've got a note there that there is no requirement to provide a cladding statement, I've put that because there's been quite a process with the development of this legislation, and there were previous drafts. So we as a group made a submission in relation to the previous drafts, which had things like a requirement for you were originally required to register your building and then prepare a cladding statement to get a fire safety engineer in and say how safe your building was, and mentioned that they've dropped that. So you might have heard about that previously. It's no longer a requirement.
That's correct.
You might be, as much as you're required to register, you may also be directed to register. So you can't be directed to register if you're outside the classes, but you might be requested to register if you have, for example, missed this deadline and it becomes apparent that you've missed that deadline. And then you would have to do that within 14 days of being notified. So registration for strata managers. So I think maybe I'll let Chris talk about this one in terms of requirements for strata managers to register, because I think you've had a look into this.
Yeah, that's right. The strata managers can register apartment buildings on behalf of the owners corporation, subject to their agreement with the owners corporation. I think the only way to manage that is that if you've had your annual general meeting and you haven't raised the issue of combustible cladding, or you're suspect of the building having combustible cladding on it, I think that you need to call a special meeting just to let the owners know exactly what your intentions are and that you need to register the building, very much like you did with the asbestos issue. If you've had your annual general meeting and you haven't raised it, or you didn't think that it needed to be raised, or you've just taken over a new building, then you need to call that special meeting, have the discussion with your owners corporation about the way forward, and that you will need to register this building. I know there'll be some issues maybe from those owners who don't understand or don't think it's necessary, but I think you have to be firm with that. Let them know, because it is a risk, and I certainly wouldn't want the risk on my shoulders, and certainly you would not want the risk to happen to your owners corporation. You wouldn't want to see the building go. So the separate online form must be completed for each building. The strata manager can actually jump online and register all of the buildings, but a separate online form must be completed for each building that is being registered. And then you've got a copy of that form, you know that you've done that. I would set up a separate file for it, just so that you know that you've done that, and that you've got a audit, a place for an audit in your office to take place. The online registration system has a number of features to reduce the burden for the strata managers. You can, as I said, register all buildings using one log-on in the account. The ability to save the draft forms for different buildings and to finalise forms at different times. And the ability to send registration details to the relevant owners corporation. So you can send those through to your executive committee or through to the owners separately. If they'd all like to have a copy, I'm sure that you could provide that. So failure to register your building really is at your own detriment. You really need to register it. Don't be worried, I wouldn't be, by the timeline being passed. The worst thing you can do is not register it at all. At least then you put it into the pipeline, and it can go through and be audited.
And I might just stop you there, Chris, because I think you might have a question from
we
the
do
audience.
have a question, yes. So we've got a question from Terry. So is it advisable for an owners corporation to join the class action in seeking compensation for required replacement of cladding?
Well, look, I think that is entirely up to your owners corporation. There's expenses associated with that, and it depends on whether or not you have cladding in your owners in your building, and whether or not it relates specifically to you. So I think that's very much a case-by-case kind of a query.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I think, sorry, you were talking about the failure to register, Chris, and obviously we can see there the significant penalties.
Significant penalties. There is fines. Yeah, if you haven't registered your building, or you've discovered by watching even the video today, watching the webinar and watching and listening to what we've said, and you're concerned, I think you should still register your building.
And I think what is particularly risky looking at those penalties for a strata manager is being caught in the middle. So you identifying cladding, bringing it to, and not bringing it to your owners corporation's attention. So therefore, where are you caught in that penalty?
Absolutely.
They can't be penalised if you never told them, in a way.
No.
So, and it looks like we have another question.
We do have a question from Alan. So with the ban on combustible cladding, why do you think government is insisting on registration for new buildings, particularly for a building where construction hasn't commenced?
I think it's going to be a matter of just, I think it's a confirming process. So I think it is essentially so that they can make sure that people are on the line for complying with the relevant cladding requirements. So whilst it may be that you're particularly comfortable that your new building does comply, I think it's more about government being seen to cross those T's and dot those I's and make sure that going forward everybody is comfortable. It's a bit like getting an extra step to a final occupation certificate or swimming pool safety or things like that. Like, yes, I have done this. It is okay. So I don't think it's something you'll be able to avoid. And to be honest, I think the process, if there is no cladding and it's a new building, will be pretty quick. It's a bit like when you have to fill out clearance certificates when you're selling a property now in terms of conveyancing. It's the same. To me, it's the same manner of managing information for the government. They don't want to be, by requiring people to submit clearance certificates, they're making purchasers and vendors manage a tax process for them. So they're making people tell them in advance whether or not they need to do this or there's any issues, so then they don't have to police it themselves. By receiving this, they can say, okay, good, that one's fine to go. So in terms of the regulations, there's some other types of statutory protection that has been introduced, and we'll just go over this at a fairly high level because I don't think that it's something that as strata managers you'll need to worry about so much in your day-to-day practice. But as a general, it might be relevant in the sense that if you're doing repair works or minor works to your building, there would have been previously certain exemptions that would apply to aesthetic building works, for example, putting on new cladding to just make things look nice or fixing things around the window that may not have needed development consent beforehand. There's been a number of variations to the legislation and to various steps, basically to say that's no longer exempt development. If it involves cladding, it's not exempt.
No.
So, and these are the particular buildings in which it will no longer be considered exempt development. And this is a list just for your reference in terms of regulations and steps that are this is a list of the steps that have been amended by the regulations. So it just demonstrates that look, they've gone through everything and they've said, yeah, no longer exempt development. We need to know if cladding's been changed, and we're just going to come down hard on this until it becomes an eradicated type of building product. And I guess going back to that previous question, I think that's what they're trying to do, is just make sure it's an eradicated building product. So by continuing to ask people to confirm they haven't used it, it will eventually phase out like asbestos. Here are some other statutory protections that have been introduced. So I think this one is quite relevant for strata schemes. So ACP is now being treated as a major defect in residential building work. So when you're acting for your owners' corporations, particularly in relation to new builds, cladding will also be covered by the extended warranty period, which is in the legislation, so which would relate to things like weatherproofing and really those significant types of defects where you can enjoy some statutory protection. Cladding's now covered by that. And also I don't think it was intended, so the Strata Schemes Management Act, when it introduced building bonds, I don't think that was intended to cover cladding, but it will now by virtue of the amendments to the Home Building Amendment Cladding Regulation.
And it has a warranty period of 6 years.
That's right.
Just like your building works do.
Yeah. So you'll be able to use those together if you find cladding in new buildings. And I think this period, particularly this transition period, is where you might find some cladding has crept in and needs to be taken off over the course of the last 2 or 3 years of relatively new builds. So it's probably going to be relevant for buildings that might be 2 or 3 years old or 5 years old, which may now be caught in this sense, and you might have some statutory protection. There's also various amendments in relation to fire safety certification, so improving on the checking and design approval.
pretty much what we were talking about before.
That's
with
right.
the escape routes and that sort of things in buildings.
That's it.
They need to have extra areas for people to get out of large high rises. Also, too, your fire safety statement.
Yes.
And when you're having your building checked for fire safety, you know, I think it needs to be included. I think, you know, you need to, I think they need to take into account everything that's in that building.
Well, look, and I think that given the consultants' obligations that have come out of the VCAT hearing, I think you'll find that consultants will be rigorous about
Absolutely,
that going forward.
I think so. Yeah.
Now, I'll just skip over this because I want to get to the practical bit, and we've only got about 5 minutes left. So this just clarifies that it's dealt with at a state level. Each state is moving at its own pace and in its own way, and the Commonwealth is letting each state and territory manage cladding in its own way. So in terms of minimising risk for strata managers, these are the things that I think we've touched on these throughout the session.
Yeah, we have.
But I think it's important to recap.
Just to go over
that. Yeah, that's right. So I don't know if you want to run with this section.
Oh, look, just minimising the risk for strata managers. Review your building portfolio to identify all buildings with cladding of any type. And that is paramount that you do that. How you do that, if you're not sure of how to identify them, ask somebody who is a builder or an expert in this area, fire safety people, whoever you deal with, ask them to have a look at your building if you're not sure. Buildings which may contravene the product use ban, example the ACP, and buildings which require registration if the regulation is extended to commercial buildings. So engage with affected owners, act on instructions, authority to investigate. So make sure you do get that authority from your owners corporation. Especially if you're calling for, I'll just go back to that, if you're calling for quotes for a building inspector to inspect your building and determine if it does have combustible cladding, then you'll need to run those quotes by your owners corporation. So you'll need to have those approved. Raise awareness, discussion at general meetings. So keep that discussion going. Investigate by engaging a fire safety engineer or other technical expert, as I said before. Identifying the practice of the precise cladding, materials and the extent of the use. And consider what records are to be held or what are held by the local council. Maybe the council has got records of what the building had put into it when it was first built. Those records might be with the council. It's a good idea just to check them to make sure if you're unsure of what is actually in the building. So that can be a good start. So take action on behalf of owners. Register the buildings with the New South Wales government before the deadlines. I know the deadlines have passed, but I believe that you should still register them. Other issues to consider, you've got contractual risk, insurance risk, consider disclosure obligations, check with your insurer to see where they stand on this. Rectification works, consider the impact on owners and users, and mitigate the risk during investigative processes, for instance, your bylaws.
And I think on that point, just to clarify some of those things, so the contractual risk we're talking about is if you have a contract in place for a particular user or a lease, say your owners corporation leases part of its space to someone else, do you have obligations to not have hazardous materials in the building? Are you in breach of your contractual obligations just by virtue of having cladding on the building? Because that's separate to the statutory obligations. That's a contractual risk.
Yeah.
In terms of your insurance risks, your disclosure obligations, as you would know, you normally have to disclose things to insurers. They're cracking down on cladding. So not only do you have a statutory obligation to register, but you also have an obligation in order to make sure your owners corporation remains insured to do proper disclosures.
Exactly right.
But you should be careful about the way in which you make disclosures if acting on behalf of your owners corporation, because you don't. It might be that your owners corporation wants to keep reports confidential until they know exactly what is discovered, and they may not want to disclose something up front because it will increase their premiums until they know that it is exactly something that is not acceptable. Also, rectification works. I guess what we're talking about there is if you need to strip out the facade, what does that mean for owners? Do they have to relocate? Who's going to pay for the cost of that?
Where's their accommodation coming from?
All those kind
things
of things.
creep
So
into
I
it.
don't have an answer for that, but that's something you need to consider consider. And where we say mitigate the risk, so whilst you don't know what it is, but you're finding out what it is, you're liaising with people, then my view would be, and what's often engaged in larger buildings, is to prohibit hot works. If you don't know if it's dangerous, then you say, whilst we're finding out whether it's dangerous, no barbecues on the balconies, no smoking anywhere in the building. And you can put a bylaw in place to do that. That protects you, that protects the other owners. So obviously we've got here seek independent advice. And I just wanted to clarify that obviously there's legal advice on how to respond. There's technical advice, which Chris has covered in terms of really getting someone who knows what they're talking about to identify what it is. But where we say contact fire and rescue and local council, I would do that with caution, because it's a bit like any other fire safety order. You may want to know whether or not it is a dangerous thing before you talk with them, because that can often trigger other things happen. Yes, so I would do that with extreme caution. And only once you're kind of comfortable, no, we've got we think that we can manage it this way. It's something to consider. I don't know that it's necessarily something to do immediately until you know what you're dealing with. So I don't know if there's anything else. It could affect you. So no, I think we covered. I think that's. Any more questions?
No, we don't have a question, but we do have just a statement from Karen. As a strata manager, I want to thank you both for a great webinar. Really helps put a sensible perspective on how to deal with the issue.
Oh, it's very kind. Thank you, Karen. Karen. Yes. Well, look. I guess in terms of just wrapping up, the key issue, I think, if you're just going to put it in a nutshell, is one, have a look at your portfolio. What's at risk? Anything over 2 stories you should be considering.
Absolutely.
2, bring it to your owner's corporation attention as soon as you can, because then the risk moves from you to them, and then you are somebody who's implementing their decisions rather than making decisions for them. And then try and register as soon as you can if you need to.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, perfect.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to our presenters, Leisha and Christine, for joining us today. Christine did fly here all the way from Albury as well, so we do appreciate both your times. And I know our members did appreciate as well. We've actually still have 100% retention rate, which is perfect. So everyone's still logged in. Alrighty, so thank you very much for our viewers today for watching the webinar on combustible cladding. If you do have any questions, you're also welcome to contact. We can share some details from our presenters if you do have any questions. Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.